And did you make the Prime Minister and his other advisers aware of the risks that this entailed in terms of readiness should our forces be called to war?
That was central to what we were saying about the need to get on with preparations. And I think I referred already this morning to the letters that we sent in October pointing out that because we hadn't agreed to option 3, the Americans were assuming that we wouldn't be there.
So, nonetheless, at this point, the view from Downing Street was that the political gain of the UN resolution should not be put in jeopardy by overt military preparations.
And let me be clear, that was also a view of a significant part of the US administration as well. I went to, in 2002, I went to the United States for the anniversary of 9/11, when the Pentagon was, I'm not quite sure the right expression, but restored within the year. And I obviously had meetings with Donald Rumsfeld, but I also had meetings with Armitage, and I think Colin Powell dropped by in the American phrase. And the State Department were completely focused on the need to get a further resolution and for the President to go the UN track, as they said. But they were not clear on the 9th as to whether or not he was going to do so, and I think his speech was the next day in the United Nations on the 10th. So even the US administration wasn't wholly clear, all parts of it, as to what was going to be the outcome. And again, back to Sir Roderick's question this morning, perhaps the best example of all of the Prime Minister influencing the President of the United States into a particular course of action, because I doubt that without his advocacy of that resolution, that the President would have agreed to it. There was clear, real doubt inside the US administration as to whether he would, even the day before.
I mean, we've asked this question of another witness. It's not quite the line of this questioning, but it's an interesting one, as to whether you think the British government would have been able to take this matter any further if there had not been a move to take this back to the UN Security Council.
To take it further?
To move along the path that we did follow in terms of military action, if at this stage the President hadn't agreed to go back to the Security Council.
So you're hypothetical as if
well,
there was
no
1441.
If there's no 1441.
Well, I mean, looking at, I have given some thought to that, looking at the Attorney General's legal opinion, I mean, he refers specifically to 1441 and had expressed some previous doubts about the lawfulness of action without a further resolution. So I assume that I'm bound to agree with you that without 1441 there might not have been the ability to bring back into play 678.
Now, I want to get back to the question of readiness for the conflict. As I understand the sequence, and we dealt with this a bit before lunch, you mentioned this meeting in late October. I think my understanding is that was largely to offer, in principle, a division to the United States, and that the question of UORs was not decided until mid-November.
That's not quite right. I need to just check, if you forgive me, the timing of this. I think, as I understand it, the original request from within the Ministry of Defence for UORs came on around the 13th of September. And there were a long list. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how many, but
I think about 190 in the end, weren't they?
And they were divided into priorities, first, second, and so on. And there was also some indication, because of the conversations that we had been having with Downing Street as to their visibility in terms of how much publicity this was likely to provoke. Once we had the approval from the Treasury, as I say, I think on the 4th of October, the overwhelming majority of those UORs were approved. So the actual work was undertaken quite quickly in the timescale. Some of them, partly for reasons of visibility, but also, I'm sure we'll get on to enhanced combat body armour in a second, but in relation to that, there was also another issue about how much we already had in stock and how much we actually needed. But nevertheless, only a small number were held back.
Let me clarify this, because General Reith has told us that he discussed with you in November, early December, the need to get ships taken up from trade, mobilisation of reserves, etc. So were these ones that were just later down the line?
I think that's a slightly separate issue. The UOR's list in September were essentially the kinds of things that we were discussing earlier, the enhancements to existing equipment that were required to conduct the kind of operations anticipated in Iraq. The question of reserves, of securing shipping. I mean, once you get to the stage of booking space on ships to transport tanks and other heavy equipment, then it's pretty clear what you're up to. So
So you saw that as even more politically sensitive than the
exactly.
war.
But that was a separate issue.
But it has some of the same issues in terms of readiness.
No, of course. But the deadline, I mean, the timing, in a sense, the timing was much less acute, because what we're talking about in relation to some of these UORs is the time taken to manufacture them, as opposed to, you know, to hire a ship.
So ideally, how long would you like to mobilise for mobilisation of reserves?
Again, I think that will depend a lot on the kinds of people that we were concerned about. But I think up to 6 months, ideally, from my recollection, but it can be done more quickly than that. There are, being too technical, there are these days different kinds of reserves. There are people who actually are engaged in their daytime regular job, but increasingly there are a fair number of people who are almost full-time reserves, who are available for operations and can move really very quickly.
But quite a lot can't.
Quite a lot can't.
So the overall situation is that this is getting quite tight.
Yes.
And you've told us before lunch that the actual decisions were only taken in the start of January about going to the south, sending the division and so on. I think these were made announcements to Parliament not long after that. So in terms of the planning assumptions by the Ministry of Defence, we were inevitably going to be in the area of having to cut corners and push things faster than we would like.
Well, I'm not sure I accept the phrase "cutting corners." There was a process for getting the equipment that was required into place. That equipment was prioritised. Some of these UORs were not necessarily for war fighting. Some of them were for the aftermath. So there is a range of equipment, and the time taken for making it available depended on whether there was some in store somewhere, with a manufacturer, or whether the manufacturer had to begin from scratch. I think some of the Desert Combats were made. Some got to theatre in time, some did not.